Welcome back to Brass Tactics. As usual, I'm your host, Joe McGiffin, and with me is our recently returned foreign correspondent, Peter Maverick Mitchell. Pete, how are we doing today?
I'm doing good, thanks. I'm probably going to crash out.
And he did. Well, this could very well end up being a short episode, folks. And he's back. The
You
only
get the
thing
high
more
CPU, you get the high CPU load. What
The
happened? Is it
only
loud
thing
now?
that is more jet lagged than Pete is his computer. So Pete just went to a defense conference in Europe or an academic conference in Germany,
Academic.
and he was going to share with us some of the ways that some of our allies and partners really view the lenses through which they view current events. Take it away, Peter.
Well, it's fun. It was put on by the Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the German military, or the Bundeswehr, in Potsdam, Germany, which is the old royal residence outside of Berlin. It's roughly equivalent to kind of Windsor. The subject of the conference was the interwar period again. So it was lessons learned from World War I and how that they were applied either correctly or incorrectly in the 1920s and 30s leading back up to World War II, which was, if the sharp-eared listeners will remember, this was the exact same theme of the last conference that I went to in Estonia last fall, actually, almost a year ago exactly. And this is obviously because the Europeans are trying to look back at the last time their militaries were trying to reform in a period of flux and see what they did correctly and what they did incorrectly, especially from an institutional level. Like, what were the things that blocked change and proper innovation? What were the things they could try to get streamlined or innovated out of or whatever? That was it. I was doing a small talk on how West Point and then the German Infantry Schule in Dresden, which is a 2-year commissioning program that they run, changed their curriculums during and after World War One. Interesting enough, West Point ended up reducing quite a bit of its military training in favor of more liberal arts, particularly history and English, whereas the German Infantry School did the opposite. It actually cut down very sharply on liberal arts and massively increased the amount of military training. So you have two different ideas of how you could adapt the lessons of World War One.
So, what is the logic there? What was the logic coming out of World War I? West Point deciding we need to know less about military tactics and more about knowledge in general. What was there? Was there causal arguments for that you came across?
Yeah, the ideas were, so the cadets at West Point pre-World War One, they spent over 800 hours, classroom hours, on horseback riding, and about another 200 hours on fencing, including the use of the bayonet. That was all lumped under military training, and that got cut almost entirely. Like, they cut riding out of the curriculum. They cut fencing entirely out of the curriculum. They also cut the drill that you would do and replaced that with athletics time in the afternoon. So instead of drilling up and down every single afternoon, every other day you now had to play sports. It was this idea that you were trying to like broaden the soldiers out.
Okay.
And like, there were things in World War I that were not necessary, right? Like the fencing, for example, the horseback riding. Yes, you need to know how to handle a horse, but they moved that to the summertime. They pulled that out of the classroom time during the academic year and moved almost all the military training to the summer. Whereas pre-World War I, it was every single day. I want to say September and April. It was kind of cool. It kind of went with the weather. So like the late spring and early fall, they did artillery because the weather was good and it was relatively dry. And then as the weather got worse, they did cavalry and then infantry stuff, because you could do infantry stuff in the worst weather possible, and then so on and so forth.
And then for the German infantry school, they went the opposite direction.
Yeah, they went the opposite way. The idea that the Germans were thinking was that all that time, like they're dealing with cadets that have graduated from the Gymnasium, which is the German high school, and they've most of them have passed the so-called Abitur, which is it's kind of like a combination SAT ACT. So they know their cadets know the basic minimum of like a certain subject. Essentially, like, they all take AP classes, so they don't need to reteach them this stuff. So they instead would send them to the regiments for 2 years and they would go to a so-called Kriegsschule, a war school, which was kind of like a finishing school while they were assigned as a cadet to a regiment. Then they went for 2 years to the infantry school, where they still had classroom time, but the classroom time was mainly focused on tactics, military history, and practical military engineering, all things that you kind of need to know. They didn't kind of do it for anything else. It was a purely military styled school. The first year was about 60-40 classroom in the field. And then the second year was about 70-30% in the field versus the classroom. And while they were out there, they were doing more, you could say, more innovative things. They were working with motorized, infantry units, so like with cars, learning how to operate these with cavalry and with infantry and what you and I would recognize as combined arms. West Point wasn't doing any of that. The cadets would just do a pontoon bridge, or they would just do artillery training, or they would just do horseback riding. They didn't do any kind of things where they would combine the troops together. But the thing is also, like, the whole point of the presentation is, like, this is all very cool and different from an academic standpoint, but ultimately you get passable, decent officers from both institutions, both good and bad. So that it's, to be honest, maybe one initially prepares the lieutenant for a little bit better than the other, but ultimately, in terms of preparing a man, in terms of
Real
character
man, you
and
must be the
competence and the
best
ability to be flexible,
sporting river.
both apparently did the job. Apparently because that's the whole point, right? You put them under a heavy amount of stress, and you try to weed out the ones that will crack in combat, ideally before that actually happens. It's the whole point of military academy.
Okay, so potential hot take here. One of the things that's often discussed when you're talking about leadership is whether you can forge a leader or if a leader is simply born, right?
Yep.
The fact that no matter what you do, good leaders is good leaders coming out of these institutions, regardless of how they approach it.
Yeah,
Would you agree that that somehow implies that leadership is something you either have or you don't?
because it's not a true control. There's no true control unless you compare it to unprofessional armies, because both of these are military academies, and there's enough similar to them. Like, there's enough, right? They're still doing the same thing. They are taking in cadets, they are putting them in a pressure cooker, and they're weeding out ones that don't meet the cut. And now their idea of the cut is slightly different, but it's still similar. They're not just taking, you know, Joseph von McGiffin, the local baron, and saying, well, you're a nobleman, so you're going to be a good fighter. Like, this is like 1300 or something. And then having you just lead a unit and you doing amazingly well. That's not the case, because leadership's more than just animal magnetism. Leadership has competence that has to be associated with it. Otherwise, no one's going to follow you anywhere. And you have to learn that competence. The character and the talent, that's both inborn and brought, and it's formed during your family, like, upbringing. That is formed, and then you're polished by the finishing school, and then you're instructed. It's not, leaders are not born or made. Leaders are born talented and able, and then they need to be shaped appropriately. And that gets even more appropriate as war becomes more complex and more needing to be fought by professional militaries, guys who do this for a living. You can't just let any geek off the street do this stuff. So yeah, okay, you can get rid of West Point. What do you do? Which is what I'm sure you're driving at. You could eliminate West Point.
No,
You
no,
would
no,
still,
no, on brass tactics, we don't
uh,
advocate any
oh,
solution.
you're just saying hot takes, right? So your hot take is we got to eliminate.
Well, yeah, I was just saying it's because that's even something they discuss here where we teach at West Point, right? Just being full disclosure, because it's one of those things that there's probably never going to be an answer to. So the closest answer you can get is a little bit of each, right? You need some sort of leadership potential to be innate to the person, and then you can bring that out with leadership training.
Yeah,
But there's always this dichotomy of is a leader born or can you make one?
you cannot. So it's, in my opinion, I use the metaphor of a steel foundry, right? The foundry itself is nothing exceptional, and you can reproduce that foundry pretty much anywhere. What you need is the raw material. If you take absolute garbage and feed it into a foundry, it's garbage in, garbage out. So as you get worse and worse cadets coming in, and then you lowered the standards to allow them to pass and graduate, the foundry is not going to do anything, dude. You cannot
Not that we're
trans
saying that that's what's happening.
not what we're saying is happening, but you cannot transmute. All right, you cannot transmute lead into gold. You cannot transmute pig iron into stainless steel. It doesn't work like that, no matter how hard you try. So it's both, frankly. And to be honest, some countries are better at this than others. You can have, I mean, look at all the countries that have attempted to ape West Point in all of its whatever pomp and its style and its curriculum, yet they have trash can militaries because they don't have good raw material. There's a lot that comes with it. There's a lot of cultural baggage that's necessary to have young men willing to submit themselves to this and to follow orders, because that's the ultimately most important thing.
So that was your piece, Pete. Was there, I mean, I hesitate to use the word interesting because you and I find different aspects of history to be different levels of interesting. But what else was sort of discussed at this topic that might have some bearing on foreign policy today? It's not a good sign that you have to think this hard about it.
Bearing on foreign policy today from the history conference. See, that's the problem. That's the problem with the discipline.
Yeah. So like where do we wildly diverge in terms of how we look at these issues from our German counterparts?
Ah, now that's a good one. Thank you. That's what I was looking for, because there was really nothing else. I was scouring my brain for things. The one of the presenters gave a report on a German officer who's named I'm not going to mention, but he served in World War II as a general, and then as a young, might have been actually, no, as a young general, and then he, after the war, he passed out to be one of the main leaders of the German army after the war, and to help in the rebuilding process. Now, of course, this German general, gave the line that pretty much all of the men of his generation do. It's like, well, we were good soldiers and we did our duty and we didn't know any of the really bad things that were happening. Okay, now that line was very convenient to the United States, Germany's handler, in the immediate post-war period, because we wanted the West Germans to have a capable military, a professional military. And for that to happen, it needed the remnants of the Wehrmacht, Hitler's army. The East Germans did not do this. The East Germans completely purged the power structure and put like farmers and factory foremen in charge of the folks here, the East German army. Completely different story. Because for the Soviets, they were making a new beginning in East Germany, and to have that happen, all the old Prussian militarism and the Nazis and all that crap had to be washed away. We, the United States, didn't want that. So the United States propagates, with the help of obviously these veterans, this kind of idea of the clean Wehrmacht, right? That, oh, we didn't do war crimes, we didn't know about them, we were all just like Erwin Rommel, who apparently now is also getting attacked for revisionist reasons. But there's no, the long and the short of this is, after the Cold War is over, we no longer need the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. So we let the academics into them, and they just savage them, absolutely savage them. And so what the American academics do, because every European academic wants to imitate American academics, the American academics start to rip the German Wehrmacht officer corps apart for all being complicit with the Nazi regime. Every single one of them guilty, all bad top to bottom. And so the Bundeswehr, the new German army, has to have a deep, introspective, soul-searching moment, because they are all criminals, and they're the fruit of criminals because there was no clean break with the World War II past. So they need to think then, what is the job of an officer in the German army? And what they apparently have come to, what they believe, because I heard it repeatedly at this conference, is that the German officer is a political animal because he serves the state, and the state is political, and war is political. Ding, Clausewitz reference. Everything the soldier does is political because it's for the state. Therefore, the soldier is a political creature, and he cannot kind of shelter behind this idea that he is not political, that he is beyond politics in any way. Because the German army claimed to be beyond politics all the time in the 20s and 30s and the 40s, and they clearly weren't, say the modern Germans. So what they need to be are citizen soldier servants, and they need to obey the state while also having so-called inner guidance, inner Führung or something, whatever the German word is. Inner guidance, which is the idea that every single soldier and officer in the Bundeswehr has a moral responsibility to ethically judge every single action that the German government is doing, and then to take a stand against it if it is not ethical.
Well, I mean, that sounds That sounds like a, more pessimistic version of kind of what we go for, isn't it? Because we certainly politics is definitely considered a dirty word. Our military is supposed to be apolitical. The Hatch Act is supposed to help enforce that for the military and all government employees. And like, for example, the late Colin Powell, he's literally called the political general for a couple of different reasons. But people argue all the time whether or not that's supposed to be a good thing because we're supposed to be apolitical in the sense that we're not tied to those things, but at the same time, we're also obligated to have this moral and ethical conscience and not to follow illegal, immoral, or unlawful orders. So that kind of sounds similar to the conclusion they came to, but their convoluted thought pattern to it just was a little hard to follow for me.
No, the Germans have a twist on it though, because this inner guidance, right? This moral code that the Germans are supposed to have, it must be in complete lockstep with what the elected government tells you to do.
Oh,
For example,
unless it's
no,
immoral, right?
no. For example, no. Morality is dictated to you from the German government.
Oh,
And if you do something else otherwise, you will be arrested and cashiered. For example, right? Because here's the thing. This is what happens.
I know several Americans
Um,
which would take exception to our government being considered a moral bastion of anything.
so consider this thought problem. You have in Germany a big refugee problem. All right. You have lots of migrants crossing the
Yeah,
borders.
well, that's just
If you
Tuesday for most of the world these days, isn't it?
especially
Most
for
of
the
the
Europeans.
left.
Hypothetically, if you're a Bundeswehr officer and you believe that this uncontrolled migration constitutes a invasion, as some people will say on the right side of European politics, all right, this constitutes an invasion and your government is aiding and abetting it, does your inner guidance permit you to take a stand against this and to say that the Bundeswehr needs to stop these migrations?
Is the right
You will be arrested.
is the right
You will
part
be
right
arrested.
is the right wing currently in an elected position of power?
No, and they will never be because they're essentially banned from that kind of action. So no, you will not be. And so what you're getting from the Bundeswehr is a enforced obedience to the state on the same level that it had in the 1930s and 40s. The exact same. Except now they're trying to spin it as a good thing, even though the end result is the exact same. You have a military that's completely subservient and controlled
I
by the
take it
political establishment.
nobody made this particular presentation at the conference.
No, nobody did. But this was a very interesting question that was asked by one of the moderators. The moderator essentially asked us on the panel, and it was me, an Austrian, and two Germans, what our definition of an apolitical military was. And I was the only one of the four who said that a military must remain apolitical because it's not like every other tool in the state. You have this. I had a German colonel right next to me saying that the military must be political all the time because that's what it is. It serves the state, and war is political. I said that's not an accurate assessment because the military is the only tool of the state that is used for explicit violence,
It's
and
because
therefore
Clausewitz specifically says it's an extension of politics using different means, implying
that's
that, yes,
correct. But
it has a political end, but it's not supposed to function the same way other political tools do.
they don't get that part. They don't get that part. And there was no mistake in translation because he said this in German. They legit say that the military is politicized because it acts politically. In German, those are the same words, by the way. I don't know if you know that. Politik. Politik means both policy and politics and politicization. It's all the same
Well,
word.
that's really interesting to hear for sure.
So I said, the soldier needs to have protections because of this, right? The soldier is judged because he must be obedient. No one else in the state apparatus owes the state loyalty and unquestioning obedience. If you're questioning your orders, you're a bad soldier. That's just a fact. Ethics are, at this point, not in the picture. What's demanded of you as a soldier is competence and character. That means loyalty and the ability to follow and obey your orders. And therefore, you must have, as Huntington properly points out in Soldier in the State, you must have a bubble of protection around you that keeps you safe from vengeance at the end of armed conflict. Because
I thought you
ultimately,
said that this conference was boring and you didn't have anything to share from it.
No, this was the only thing that really stuck out, and I'm the only one saying that. And if you're going to say this, if you're going to say that the military is politicized and political in all things, the soldier will always be wrong. If he follows orders and the regime is doing something wrong, he
Oh,
will
yeah, this
be
sounds
dead.
100% a recipe for scapegoatage,
It
100%.
is scapegoatage because the German military takes it because it's completely politically emasculated. It has nothing to back up against. They're loathed by their population because their population's been taught to loathe them because to the German public it was the military that caused World War One, right? Military backed by the evil Hohenzollerns. It was the military who kept the Nazis in power, right? Etc. etc. All the way back to the Holy Roman Empire. It's always the military at fault. And that's why they do this. It is totally scapegoating. Because, like I said, the soldier's always wrong. If he disobeys orders, he'll be shot or, you know what I mean, or cashiered. And also, he's ruined his oath because he's no longer a soldier. It's what Huntington says again. Like, you can choose. Like, here you are. You're in the middle. You're a apolitical army officer. The Nazis have taken over. You have three choices. That is it. You have three choices because you can either jump in with both feet and become a Nazi yourself to try to advance your career, which many men did, like Zepp Dietrich and Joachim Peiper, or Keitel and Rom and a bunch of others. So you could become a Nazi, but now you're no longer a professional soldier. You're now a political officer. You voided your oath. Option two, you can fight against the Nazis like von Moltke the Younger or Klaus von Stauffenberg or others. And now you've voided your oath because you're no longer a professional soldier. You're a rebel and you're going to be hung for it or shot. And then option three, you try to stay in the middle, which is what 99% of them do. You try to follow the orders where you have to. You try to cheat the orders that are really unethical and really bothering you morally. You try to get around them somehow, like Rommel with the commando order in North Africa. But you stay in the middle and you desperately try to protect yourself and you protect your family and you protect the things that are important to you because that's the only way to survive. And the war's over and you lose and you've lost it anyway. Even though you tried to stay in the middle, you've voided your professionalism because the winners come in and say, you're guilty. You didn't try to kill Hitler. They lose. But like I said, I didn't say all of that. I said something much more condensed within about 30 seconds. But like I said, but it's all over their heads. They don't get it. When they hear apolitical to the German, it means pilot washing his hands. That's all they think of because they've lost and they've lost twice. They don't have a positive opinion. They don't have an Omar Bradley, right? They don't have a George Washington. They don't have a William Tecumseh Sherman, right? They don't have these guys who are just soldiers and they execute and then they fade away, like MacArthur says, when they're done. They don't have that because they've lost twice and we won't let them forget it. It's a really bitter pill. And so the foreign policy implication of this, the Germans will never, ever have a military that can function.
Sounds like they'll go to great lengths to avoid using their military by any means, since it's a total catch-22 for everybody involved.
No, they are. They are. They're talking so proudly of this brigade-sized base they're building in Lithuania, which is literally on their borders of the Baltic Sea, right? The little brigade size. This is the first German deployment in almost a century of a brigade in Lithuania. And that brigade, I guarantee you, none of the equipment works. The morale's very low, and the Poles could clean them up in 2 seconds. If the Poles wanted, they could take all of Germany in about a week. It's pathetic. The Germans wouldn't lift a single finger to defend themselves because the Germans think they deserve it. If bad things happen to them, they deserve it. It's what they've been told.
That's sort of sad,
Well,
honestly.
whose fault is it? Okay, because we didn't do this to the Japanese.
Well, it's like sort of just like a testament to like the greater powers of like learned
Yes,
culture.
it's very powerful. It's actually a huge argument for constructivism in my book. Massive argument to constructivism
The
because the
most
Germans have been
depressing
completely.
social experiment I've ever heard of.
It is.
Because it's literally like the Clausewitz was essentially a German. He was a Prussian, but like they literally wrote the book on war not 200 odd years
Yes, and
ago.
his countrymen are the most pacifistic race in Europe. Right? They are. They don't want to fight. They won't fight. They would refuse to. I guarantee it. Because any nature to the opposite that the German will want to fight for something will be immediately stamped out by its government as anti-democratic and illiberal and militarist. The Japanese have their own massive set of bags, because we've done a number on both these guys, right? We took the two most militaristic and assertive cultures on the planet and we castrated them in the 1940s, and neither of them pose any threat to any of their neighbors ever again. The problem is now, as the United States is in sunset, can they defend themselves or their neighbors? And the answer looks like no for the Germans, and I wouldn't bet on it for the Japanese. Doesn't look great. Fortunately for the Europeans, we got the Poles, and they got more than enough freaking, because remember, the Poles, they magically end up on the wrong side of the war and they lose. Well, actually, or I guess the right side for them, just not the, for the long term. And bonus, number one, they're victims. Number two, they never colonized anybody. So it's really hard to apply woke politics against the Poles because they're not really guilty of very much.
Yeah, I've seen their prime minister. I've seen snippets of it, and they seem very resistant to having narratives imposed on them.
Oh, they're a very proud people, and they laugh in the face of that kind of attempt of generalization of white guilt. The Poles literally laugh at that. Most Eastern Europeans do, but especially the Poles. It's a cartoon to them. Like, really? Whatever. So like I said, you got the Poles. In East Asia, you don't really have anything like that, unfortunately. What are you going to have, South Korea? No, not really. You have India, but that's a force for the negative, by the way, right? The Indians, right? They have no, you're not going to play woke talk to the Indians. They're going to laugh at you, but they're on the anti, what would we say, free trade side? The BRIC Italians?
Mostly anti-Chinese.
Well, they're anti-Chinese when convenient, but they're pro, other things, pro-Russian when convenient. They're the wild card.
Well, thanks for sharing.
Sorry. That was definitely a rant. You'll probably have to cut a lot of stuff out of that, dude.
I'm not going to cut half as much as you think I was going to cut. Are you okay with it being published?
Yeah, I don't care. I don't name names. It's Chatham House rules. I said what was being said, and I didn't say, anybody's name.
I probably wasn't going to change too much because it takes a lot of energy to do that, and I don't know how I'd do that and still keep it the rant interesting.
But for real, I'd love to open it up. I'd love to open this up to the audience, by the way. If you want to open it up to the audience and say, like, hey, like, freaking reach out. If you believe that the Germans might fight back if someone invades them, I'd love to hear it. But right now, it doesn't look great. Sometimes you can be too successful at completely neutering a country.
Any engagement for brass tactics is good engagement.
Right. And I didn't profess a solution either.
And on that note, thanks for listening this week. We are actually planning to soft launch a full brass tactics media suite where we'll do a little bit of writing. We'll do a little bit of writing, which includes Pete. So Pete's going to have to commit to actually doing a little bit of writing. We'll keep doing this podcast. We're just going to sort of expand the umbrella a little bit. Everything is still going to be based around our original mission set, which is just sort of make foreign policy and strategy more accessible to the everyday voter, so that when people are having debates or whatever else is going on in the news, none of this fills over your head anymore, or over anyone's head, except all those missiles like Anduril's new missile line, the Barracuda. Maybe Brass Tactics will eventually start talking to adults and interviewing adults and things like that, and posting.
Boy, we'd really break out.
But we're dollars and input are certainly appreciated as we try to get this little fledgling media press empire off the ground, giving knowledge back to the people without the politics. So if you like what you heard there, if you like what you heard here, tell your friends about us, leave us a nice review, or leave us a not so nice review, but preferably a nice review. And definitely let us know what you think, or if you're willing to help out in some way. Certainly, if you've got a little piece that you've written somewhere and you're looking at somewhere to shop it around, hey, give it to us. And on that note, see you all next week for a topic that is once again to be determined, because it's just that time of the year. It's literally that time of the year when there's literally nothing happening in the defense community because budgets aren't supposed to go live again until October 1st. And even then, still sort of just have to wait on U.S. Congress to actually agree on how much funding they'll get before they can continue. So worst case scenario, maybe we talk about the boring lamentations that are the congressional funding structure systems for the National Defense Authorization Act.
You're bro, you're putting me to sleep, and I didn't even know.
Well, that's why we're keeping these things to 30
Yeah,
minutes, and we record them at bedtime.
that's right.
Anyway,
That's right. Go.
thank see you all next week.